it is very good to be with all of you at St. Peter's today. Very good to worship with all of you, to confirm some of our friends and neighbors from St. Andrew's Encinitas. And we had confirmations also of people from St. Peter's at 5 o'clock last night and 8 o'clock this morning. So we've had a wonderful celebration of confirmations and receptions. Some years ago, my family traveled overseas. I'm going to scooch back a little so I can see all of you. So we traveled overseas, and on our way home, we stopped in that great crossroads of the whole world, Heathrow Airport. Now, this happened to be during the London Olympics a few years ago, and the Olympic Games were on every TV. But otherwise, it was like every airport everywhere, only more so. So Heathrow is truly an international airport, a crossroads of the world. So people of every nation and race and ethnic background were there, speaking every language under the sun. But like every airport, it was full of tired and bored people. For the most part, no one was looking at or talking to anyone else. People talked only to their own families in hushed whispers. If you happened to meet somebody's eye, you might nod quickly or just glance away. Basic airport manners everywhere. It was a crowd full of bored and lonely and separated people when something happened. I heard some kind of a commotion. I looked up, and there was a woman holding an Olympic torch. She was smiling, she was friendly, she was talking, holding the torch out to a pair of children and their parents were taking pictures. Other people started to gather around and have their pictures taken, and the woman told her story. She had been an Olympic runner several Olympics ago, and she had been invited to carry the Olympic torch part of it the way through Britain on its journey to London, and was now on her way home with her souvenir torch. She smiled and laughed and let people have their pictures taken with the torch, and people gathered around, their reserve melting, drawn to her personal warmth and to the powerful symbol of the flame, bringing people together from all races and countries. And an airport lounge full of tired and dispirited people, all speaking different languages, suddenly became a community, laughing and talking together about the one thing that brought us together, this powerful symbol of unity. Well, that experience in Heathrow Airport, of course, was not a religious experience, but it does have a few important things in common with the powerful unifying experience that was Pentecost. As the story opens from the book of Acts, faithful Jews from every corner of the world are gathered in Jerusalem for the Jewish festival of Pentecost, which happens 50 days after Passover, and is one of the three great Jewish festivals that would bring people to Jerusalem each year. By the disciples' time, in around 30 AD, the Jews had been scattered all over the world. They spoke many different languages, but they still came together on Pentecost to remember the one thing they had in common. What was celebrated on Pentecost was God's gift of the law to Moses on Mount Sinai. So Pentecost was a gathering to celebrate the unity of God's people in the midst of the huge diversity of people in the world. Their common religion gave them what they needed to overcome their vast differences, made more glaring by the variety of languages and national groups represented. It is a great truth of human existence that human pride causes us to create divisions and conflicts. And that one of the great failures of humankind is that we cannot communicate with each other, that we are sadly divided and mistrustful and competitive. One of the symbols of our human divisions is our different languages, which often are markers of greater ethnic and national and racial divisions between us. Human language is one of the characteristics that our species universally shares, that allows us to be the social beings that we are, to cooperate and communicate and form community. Yet it is also the basis of misunderstanding and conflict. We judge people by their language, even when they speak the same language we do. We judge them by their accent and their grammar and the words they choose. Language unites us with people who are like us, but language can also divide us from those who are different. That is our sad human state. And language in this human state becomes not just an instrument of communication and community, it can also become a fomenter of conflict and injustice. You only have to glance at the news to see that human beings corrupt the great gift of language by using it to hurl ever more damaging insults and threats at each other. An example of the pride of human beings corrupting a beautiful gift by misusing it for the very opposite purpose from the one for which it evolved or was created. Pentecost gives us a picture of a new way to live, a new way to be the people of God. In the story of Acts, these people of various languages and nations gather in Jerusalem. But probably most of them don't know that there is a smaller gathering going on in Jerusalem at the same time. The disciples of the crucified and risen Jesus were all together and praying as they had been every day since Jesus ascended into heaven. The leader whose warmth and magnetism and inspiration brought them together was gone. Yet he had promised that those who believed in him would do even greater works than he did. They would heal and preach and raise the dead. And he had promised that those who loved him would receive the gift of the advocate, the Holy Spirit. It must have seemed impossible to them, but they gathered and they prayed. When suddenly something happens that Luke, the author of Acts, can't explain. He can only try to describe it, like a rush of violent wind, like tongues of fire, something almost tangible. The advocate, the Holy Spirit, descends on these followers of Jesus. And these uneducated Galilean fishermen suddenly begin to speak in every language of the world so that everyone hears and understands in their own way. It may be a miracle of speaking, it may be a miracle of understanding. Whatever it is a miracle of communication and unification. The disciples are gripped by a power that is greater than they are. They are swept up into a movement that they don't understand. And people who were separated by race and language and country of origin suddenly are unified around a common message. The Holy Spirit draws them together and makes a disparate and lonely crowd into a community that all understands one message, the good news of Christ. Which I believe can be an antidote to the great divisions and conflicts of our time. In a world of division, miscommunication, isolation into ever smaller pockets of allies, all pointing fingers at enemies and blaming each other for the ills of the world, Jesus gives us the gift of love and the means to communicate love to our neighbors. That is the work of the church, to share the good news of Christ and to invite others to walk with us deeper into discipleship and to spend a lifetime learning how to follow Jesus. But let's face it, Episcopalians are notoriously reluctant to talk about Jesus. And we're reticent in a world where many Christians are using their power to speak words of hatred and division that are antithetical to the love of Jesus. We are reluctant to counter that false gospel with our own words of God's love. We're happy to express our love for God in worship with other like-minded people. We're dedicated to serving others through generous ministries of outreach and service, but we're reluctant to share the good news. Yet that's what Jesus calls us to do, to proclaim the good news of Christ in word and example. And that is what Pentecost gives us the power to do, to speak God's words to those who need to hear them. Because without this Pentecostal miracle of communication, without the violent rush of wind and the power of the Holy Spirit, the disciples would never have been able to transform the world with the love of Jesus the way they did. We can see the truth of what they experienced by the actions they took, by the world-changing effect they had on the people around them. And Pentecost is something that we can understand and experience too. We make a mistake when we think that Pentecost only happened once. In the book of Acts, that same coming of the Holy Spirit happens over and over to different groups of people gathered in different ways. Pentecost was not one event like Christmas and Easter. Pentecost is a way of life. Pentecost happens every time God comes into the midst of a group of believers and gives them words and inspiration and energy to make a difference in the world. Pentecost happens every time one of us grows deeper in faith and begins to experience the work of the Spirit in our lives. Pentecost happens each time the church experiences an awakening and finds new ways to reach new people. Pentecost is life that brings people together, gathered together by an experience of God's presence that we describe as flame, wind, fire of passion for God's kingdom. On Pentecost, we are set on fire for Christ, empowered to communicate that experience to others, inspired to do mission in God's name. Pentecost is what our church needs today, because Pentecost gives us grace and power to share God's love in language others can hear and understand. So I invite you, during this week of Pentecost, to ask God for words of grace and power. I invite you to think about one way in your life you can share Christ's news of love. I'm not talking about knocking on doors and asking people if they've been saved. You can do that if you want to. But what I'm talking about is the coworker who needs words of compassion, the unhoused person who needs to hear that they are important in God's eyes, the child who needs to know what it means to be seen and heard and taken seriously. I'm talking about the person who thinks our present climate of insults and vitriol is the only way to live, who might respond to gentle words of care for the world. I'm talking about the lonely person who is seeking new meaning and purpose in life, who just might respond to an invitation to enjoy what you have found at St. Peter's or St. Andrew's. I'm suggesting that just as much as the disciples on Pentecost, you have the power to share God's good news of love, inviting people to experience the love of Christ. And when you do that, you allow the Holy Spirit to light a torch in you that brings people together across divisions and helps Christ's church to flourish in the world.